This is the Deliberate Talks Weekly Podcast, powered by the Pixelated Egg Digital Ventures. Tune in every week to learn something new about digital marketing and entrepreneurship. And now, over to the voice of your host, Dakshin Adyanthaya. Enjoy the show.
Hello, hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, bonjour. Welcome back to the Deliberate Talks podcast, and this is Dakshin Adyanthaya, not here to brag about his poor linguistic skills, but is here to set the tone for today's episode, which is all about learning new international languages from a technomad language hacker. But before we get there, here are some engrossing facts about language learning. According to Ethnologue, currently 7,117 known languages are spoken by people around the world. Less than 1% of people worldwide are proficient in many languages, but a person who knows more than 3 languages is called as a polyglot. And with over 1,130 million native speakers, English is the most spoken language in the world. Also, the English word goodbye was originally a contraction of God be with ya. And in Spain, there's a language entirely made of whistling called Selbogomero. Did you know this? Well, then it's time to indulge in this wonderful conversation of languages. So let's get straight into talking more about it with our guest today. He is a very well-known Irish polyglot, author, blogger, and the founder of Fluent in 3 months. His company hosts language learning challenges for aspiring language learners called the Fluent in 3 months Challenge. Apart from this, he has given multiple TEDx talks, was named as the Traveler of the Year by National Geographic magazine, and has authored numerous books that aim to provide all those interested with valuable strategies and insights into the world of language learning. He's also the host of the Language Hacking Podcast. Here's introducing Benny Lewis. Hello, Benny.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good.
Superb. Firstly, Benny, thank you so much for being a part of the Deliberate Talks podcast. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Benny, I heard till 21, you only spoke one language, which was English. What happened to you after that? Like, what was the eureka moment like to transform your skills, and how many languages do you speak today?
So I had studied electronic engineering and I really did not have any good experiences with learning languages in school.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought maybe just by living in a country that might solve my problem. And I actually did move to Spain after I graduated university. And it unfortunately didn't solve the problem for me, because for the first few months, all of my friends that I ended up spending time with, they were all either Spaniards who spoke English or they were native English speakers like myself.
Right.
So living in the country did not actually make things any easier for learning a language. But my eureka moment came about 6 months into the experience when I was trying a lot of different things that were failing in terms of language learning strategies. But one thing I tried was an approach where I would not speak English for an entire month outside of my work, because I was an English teacher. So obviously I had to speak English, but outside of my work, I would only use Spanish, even though my Spanish was absolutely terrible. And I was able to do things that I did not imagine I would have been able to do. So I was able to get a refund on a broken toothbrush. I was able to have basic conversations with people. And it was very messy. I sounded like Tarzan or whatever, but I was able to communicate. And I realized in that moment that communication, as long as that's your goal as an absolute beginner, then your whole world opens up. And that gives you the ability to then start to make progress. And eventually I did reach mastery level in Spanish, where I can work as an electronic engineer through Spanish now. And then I continued to travel and learn other languages. And eventually I made my language learning entirely online. So I never tell people that they have to travel to the country. And like I said, it didn't even work for me at first.
Right.
So that's kind of how I got into learning languages. And of course, my business built itself around that.
Right. And how many languages do you speak today?
It depends on what your definition of speak a language is.
Hmm.
But in general, if we say fluency is what's known on the European Common Framework stage as B2 levels, this is where I'm socially equivalent, where I can go to a social event like a barbecue or to a pub and hang out with people and interact with them in the exact same way that I would in my mother tongue.
Hmm.
So if that's what the understanding is, then six languages.
Okay. And apart from that, how many languages can you read or write or speak? How many would that be?
Well, I've dabbled in almost 30 languages over the last 17 or so years.
Uh-huh.
And I know I could reactivate a lot of them in a relatively short time. And I can recognize a lot of them if I see writing or if I hear small amounts of audio. But I would really need to put in a couple of weeks to reactivate them. So I definitely would not claim any level in those several dozen languages without like serious work ahead of time to refresh them.
Makes sense. And Wikipedia terms you as technomad language hacker. What does that really mean?
Well, it's a lot more common nowadays, but I started traveling in 2003. And a few years into this, I started working online while traveling. And right now, that's obviously very, very normal. But back when I did it, it was quite unique. So I was a nomad, but I was a nomad who used technology to fund his travels. So I
Mhm.
like the term tech nomad because of that.
Interesting. And what is Fluent in 3 months? When did you decide to begin this? And why did you think that something like this was a need of the hour?
So I had been traveling at this stage. This was 2009. I had been traveling for 6 years and I was really enjoying it. And I would run into people and they would say to me, "Wow, you're so smart. You speak all these languages." And I completely disagreed with that. I didn't think it had anything to do with my natural intelligence because I failed to learn languages for a long time. I
Hmm.
thought it was about my approach. And I really passionately felt that anybody could do what I was doing.
Yes.
So I would explain to them one on one, no, 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 this is what you need to do to learn a language. And of course, that was very, very difficult to scale. And I would have to repeat myself a lot. So I saw a blog as a means to get my message out to as many people as possible. And the title Fluent in 3 months, it's not a promise or a recipe. It's more a case of I try to have very high objectives in very specific timeframes. And I shared my projects to learn languages to fluency in 3 months. And I don't necessarily tell people you have to have that same goal. I try to get people who kind of join in my private communities and such to at least have their first smooth conversations in 3 months, even if they don't reach fluency. But for
Mhm.
me personally, that's what I was sharing, the story. So I registered that blog URL and I started to write consistently and share how I was doing with my language story. And with time, I grew a very large audience and was able to inspire a lot of people.
Right. And then why did you think that there was something like this which was needed, which was one part? And the other part is how did it shape up once you grew your community of people who wanted to be a part of this?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was crucial for me from the very beginning was to be as authentic as possible. And I know when maybe a lot of people who are listening try to imagine growing an online following, they may think to themselves, I need to read all about this and I need to research this, maybe spend a few months learning new skills before I launch a blog. That's not the way that I did this.
Mhm.
I had the idea to launch the blog and the next day, I wrote my first blog post and I had a lot to learn. So my first blog post was terrible. It was just a wall of text. I didn't have any good spacing in it. I didn't have any image in it. And I just learned through feedback with people that, oh, it would be good if you split up your paragraphs a little bit. It would be nice if you had a photo that kind of depicted what you were talking about. And I was kind of learning the process of blogging while doing it. And I know there's loads of blogging courses now. There were probably a few blogging courses back then too, but I really passionately feel you learn by doing. And because of that, people were interested in helping me to grow the blog. But as well as that, the story aspect was the main thing.
Mhm.
That there were other blogs about learning languages, but they were a bit more technical, like, here's how you conjugate a verb or something like that. And at the time, there was nobody really sharing a story of here is me trying to learn a language from start to finish and adding something interesting to it. Like, I'm also traveling to the country and I'm also uploading videos to YouTube about my progress. And
Mhm.
that story was what really brought people in, and they wanted to see how I did. And I would share both the successes and the failures, because I had a new project every few months. So this meant that some of them went very well and some of them didn't.
Mhm.
And that part of it meant there was no guarantees, but you would see how I did regardless in this story. And because of that, more people would share it, especially at the start of my project. I'd have a big build up and a launch, and the interest would be kind of growing from people guessing, like, what's the next language he's going to be. So
Mhm.
that story really tied in, and that was a big reason for why my blog grew very quickly in the first years. Because, like, for instance, I never did any SEO. I didn't know anything about optimizing my blog for search engines.
Mhm.
And to this day, I don't even know how to do that. I eventually hired somebody who would work on my blog and do that stuff for me. But I never did that at the beginning. My blog grew entirely from social shares from people who just found the story interesting.
But you use email marketing effectively.
Yeah, that's right. So, like I said, one of the things was that I liked people to be guessing what the next language was going to be.
Mhm.
And I enticed people to join my email list by saying on the blog, lots of ways to get people on an email list. You can give them a free ebook or something. But the
Mhm.
way I did it was I said, if you join the email list, I'll give you clues to what my next language is going to be.
Mhm.
And I would give those clues in the emails once a week and build up over a month before I'd announce something. And obviously, I would make those clues. I would phrase them such that you couldn't really Google the answer to see what the language might be,
Mhm.
and that kind of helped build up suspense and add to the story, and that created that curiosity aspect,
Mhm.
and that really enticed a lot of people to join the email list. And obviously, I've expanded on that over the years with, like, giving people free courses. When, like, nowadays, if someone joins, they get a speak in a week crash course for a week.
Mhm.
But essentially, as I would mix things up, try things out, I grew that email list pretty well. And it's at about 300,000 subscribers at the moment.
Wow.
And of course, I try to make sure that my open rate is still high, because there are people with email lists with hundreds of thousands of people on them,
Mhm.
but they just are so aggressive when they send emails that eventually just people don't open those emails, even if they're still subscribed. And I didn't want that. I wanted to make sure that people were still interested in my emails. So it's something that throughout the years, no matter what, I've always had some kind of a personal story introduction to my emails every Friday to make sure that that connection is with people and that it's relevant to them.
Right. Speaking of relevancy, obviously, there's a lot of conversations on the internet, on forums, on threads, where they talk about your work, they respect your work, all that you have achieved over the years. But there are also conversations within those forums where people are really curious. They talk about your methods of learning and, more importantly, learning a language in 3 months. Some claim it takes a year or two to learn a language completely. But like you mentioned, it's not a guarantee. But what happens in those 3 months? What does one really get exposed to in those 3 months of learning?
Yeah, and I understand that skepticism, because I took German in school for 5 years. And after those 5 years, I could barely string a sentence together. It can sound very counterintuitive if somebody says that you could do so much more in 3 months, because if you compare it to that personal experience, then you just think, like, how is that even possible? Like, if I, before I got into languages, looked at my German experience, I would imagine it would take 30 years for me to learn German because I had learned so little in 5 years. But what changes is absolutely the approach. So, in a lot of traditional learning approaches, it is that it's learning, it's studying, it's treating the language like it's an academic subject. and that every mistake you make is like a red X that brings you closer to a fail.
Mhm.
And I really believe that languages cannot be processed that way. You can't learn a language, you can only live a language. That means that like you change your approach to be speaking it from the beginning, being okay with sounding a little bit like a caveman, and being comfortable with making mistakes. And that changes the entire context, that it's not about sitting down with a dusty old grammar book. It's about conversations. And I tell people the main secret in my language learning is speak from day one.
Mm.
So anytime I'm giving people advice, I always try to get them at least to be making video calls with their teachers, to be practicing right from the get go. You don't need to go to the country for that. There's lots of ways you can find native speakers to practice with online.
Mhm.
And that's kind of changed the context, that if you do that, you will definitely be at least conversational within a few months if you're speaking the language every day. And then, of course, to reach a higher level like fluency, it'll always depend. And like I said, I can't even guarantee it for myself. I've
Mhm.
had fluent in 3 months projects that I did not succeed in, but
Right.
I've also had some that I have. And it's been about implementing the good approach, where every single day, not only am I getting that spoken session practice, but I'm also analyzing after each spoken session, what are my biggest weaknesses? How can I fix them? And then if I am studying, it's very, very intentional studying to be better for that next spoken session, rather than learning the language in general and learning like vague vocabulary that maybe one day I might need. I am a lot more directional with my language learning.
Mhm. Right. And the language hacks that is a part of your curriculum, and also the videos and the content that you put as a part of your content creation process. How did you come up with these and how effective are these?
Well, a language hack is essentially a unique way to learn a language that's very different to traditional language learning. So
Mhm.
that can be one of many, many different things. As an example, when I was learning German in school, I would be presented with a list of, like, say, 20 words, and I would have to memorize them. And they never taught me how to learn vocabulary in school.
Mm.
So the thing a lot of us do is rote memorization, where we just simply repeat the word to ourselves over and over and over again and hope that it eventually seeps in. And that's just not efficient. I mean, eventually it'll kind of work, but it's just not a very effective way to learn vocabulary. So a language hack takes that, turns it around to something a lot more efficient. So, as an example, you might use mnemonics. You
Mm.
might think of an interesting connection to another word that you know, and that'll help you remember it in future. Or you might use flashcards that have a very specific algorithm for how they show you the words.
Mhm.
So just about right. Because another thing I would imagine when I saw the list of words in school is, there must be some secret that you'll see the word once and then remember it forever.
Mhm.
And, if you have a super memory, maybe you can do that. But for the rest of us, we do need repetition, but you can have that repetition in a more efficient way. So, all of these interesting, non traditional ways of learning vocabulary, they count as a language hack. And any other problem that I'm trying to solve in language learning, if it's more unique and innovative, that for me makes it a language hack.
Right. Interesting. And about these people who sign up for your content and consume your content, tell me about these people. What's their experience like, and how has Fluent in 3 months kind of transformed their lives professionally or even personally for that fact?
Well, I make sure to poll my audience as often as I can and see what they're really looking for. And generally, there's not so much of an academic background for people. So they're not using my courses or my content to help them pass an exam,
Mhm.
unless specifically it's the oral part of their exam. So I do help people with that. But I am very open about the fact that I don't talk about passing exams.
Mm.
So, with that in mind, my audience tends to be people who have always dreamed about learning another language. So, whether that's for just pure interest, like they would love to travel to the country someday, or
Mm.
maybe there's a real personal connection. And I've gotten some very heartwarming stories from people who have talked to their grandmother for the first time in their life because their grandmother speaks their heritage language and they could never speak that themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So little things like that, just like there are lots of reasons that people have to learn their language, but generally there's an aspect of passion to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's that like real drive that they truly want to learn this language and that they feel it'll enrich their lives in some way. And
Mm-hmm.
that's generally what I found, and that's what I bank on. And that's what makes my blog. I mean, lots of similar blogs nowadays that have kind of gone with the same idea that I originally had, but
Mm-hmm.
it's what definitely set my blog aside initially is that there were plenty of language blogs when I started, but they were all very technical. So they would be for people who maybe love languages, and that's they love languages in and of themselves, and they're passionate about like being able to read newspapers in the language and acquiring vocabulary, and they have more of a linguistic passion, which there's lots of good things to say for, but that's not what I'm about. I'm about more the practical aspect of using the language to interact with people. And when that overlaps with my audience interest, then that's what makes the difference. And that's what I can say brings them all together, is that they all truly want to actively speak the language themselves.
Mm-hmm. And which is your favorite story from all the success stories that you've had?
Oh, so there's so much. I mean, like I said, I've had people write to me about speaking to their grandmothers. I've had a lot of people, ironically, send me messages saying that thanks to me, they've met their partner in life, and they'll send me a photo of their, like one guy a year or two ago sent me his wedding photo, and his wife only speaks Spanish, and the only reason he was able to spend time with her, get to know her, and eventually form the relationship with her was because he went through my materials to have the confidence to speak Spanish.
Wow.
And like a lot of what I'm doing is just giving them that encouragement and confidence, because a lot of people can do this, and sometimes they already have the skills, but they just need somebody to give them permission to know that it's okay to be a beginner. And this guy was telling me that this has happened, and it boggles my mind that there may be children who are being born now who wouldn't have existed if it weren't for me writing about language learning, which just is completely crazy thought to me. But I've seen a lot of stories like that, people who have met their partners, people who've had just the most enriching travel experiences, people who've grown their careers and gotten very well paid jobs because they were able to stand out from the competition thanks to speaking a language. There's just so many positives that come from this, and so many stories.
Mm-hmm. Right. Speaking about that travel aspect as well, you mentioned that you have also traveled to so many countries. Speaking fluently to the locals, like you could prepare yourself for a country that you're going to, but in terms of immersing yourself into a culture and language process, how do you really start, or where do you really start, or how do you indulge in it?
Well, the first thing is definitely to learn the language before you go to the country. I have lots of experiences myself of arriving in the country not speaking a word.
Mhm.
And it has a certain sense of adventure, and I enjoyed those experiences, but they were also very limiting. And I missed out on opportunities to get to know the country because it was mixed in with the language learning aspect. So I always recommend people learn the language ahead of time. So, if you can't travel right now, that's fine. You can still learn the language. But once I would arrive in the country, and once I would have a certain level to be able to speak to people, it changes everything. I'm able to make local friends. I'm able to find opportunities to get immersed in the culture, and even simple things like finding accommodation and food way, way more affordable. Like, as an example, when I was living in Rio in Brazil, I had this spectacular penthouse apartment with a view of the Statue of Christ and the Sugarloaf Mountain, these famous icons of Rio. And it was so big that I could throw parties there all the time. And if I had found that on Airbnb in English, it would have been maybe $1,000 a week or something like that.
Wow.
But because I found it in Portuguese by speaking to the locals, I think I was paying $200 a month for this place.
Wow.
So an absolutely different experience that even as somebody on a tight budget, I could live these really interesting, multiple different lifetimes worth of things because of the advantage that the language brought me. And of course, I would make local friends. And that's been a theme of my travels that I know lots of other people who've traveled the world and who blog about it as well.
Mhm.
And they have very interesting experiences themselves too. But generally, the people that they hang out with have to be other English speakers, either fellow travelers or locals who speak English.
Right.
And if you're talking to the locals who speak English, you're very much restricting yourself, especially in a lot of countries where that's not as common. And the rich experiences that I've had from making local friends and the fact that I could share my culture with them, I could tell them about Ireland and show them what non-nationals of their country are like. I was the first non-Brazilian that so many hundreds of Brazilians have met because I left Rio. I mean, in Rio, there's lots of tourists, but I left Rio for smaller towns and I was literally the first foreigner they had ever met in their life. And that just like was an amazing experience for me. And they were so welcoming and so interested in hearing my story. And I obviously wanted to get to know them and I would see a different side of the world, very different to how I grew up. And it's just the richness of the experiences. I just can't describe it.
And just out of curiosity, how did things like, getting into the polyglot community or the TEDx and the various other things happen to you?
Well, the polyglot community is interesting because I didn't really have much experience with other polyglots for
Mhm.
most of my travels, since I was the only person generally learning the language for so many years. But of course, there were other people with similar interests and other people who maybe they weren't traveling as much, but they might live in international cities and have opportunities to speak other languages.
Right.
And at first, what was more interesting when I first started blogging was that people really cared more about the differences. So there would be these clashes where I would say speak from day one, but another polyglot, their approach might be to read a lot in the language and to wait and not speak until later because their goals were different. And
Mm.
at first, that's what really stood out were those differences. But with time, I would interact with them and we would make collaboration videos together and we would see that obviously we have a lot more in common than our differences.
Right.
And eventually there were conferences that were started to bring these polyglots together. And it's just been its own separate community that's been absolutely fascinating. And I have my place in that community. And
Mm.
I very much respect so many of these other polyglots. And it's just so interesting to see what they do because we all have the same underlying goal to inspire language learners,
Right.
but I have my particular branding and my language hacks and things like that around.
Right.
And so that's the polyglot community. When it comes to other things like talks and such, I've been very active in making sure that I network with other bloggers and the polyglot community has been interesting, but generally in terms of growing my audience, I actually interact with a lot of bloggers who have nothing to do with languages. So
Mhm.
I have very good friends who, like I said, are travel bloggers, but they don't write about language learning. Or I have friends who write about fitness or who write about minimalism. And I've gone to events where I get to interact with them. I've become friends with them. And it's just so cool to see how they share their message because it's got nothing to do with languages, but they're very passionate about their subject. And I've learned a lot from that. I've learned strategies for blogging and for expanding my audience thanks to seeing what they do. And that's how I've gotten to the stage of being able to give the likes of TEDx talks and speaking at other conferences and winning awards and so on. I've learned that from people who are blogging about things that are in completely different niches.
Mhm. Fantastic. From a professional aspect of polyglots, of course, there's a huge demand for translators and writers who are equipped with foreign language skills. But how much does the industry really pay these experts? And where can one find opportunities once they learn a new language?
So I'm not sure necessarily how their pay would work. I wouldn't be familiar with the specifics of that. I do know that when I was looking for work myself before I ever got into language learning, I took my degree in electronic engineering. And once I added languages to the mix, everything changed. Because when I graduated, I put a lot of time and effort into my degree. And I thought because of that, it would be very easy for me to get a job. I had my degree in electronic engineering.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there are so many people who have degrees in electronic engineering that it's very hard to distinguish yourself from them.
Mhm.
So if you're starting off, then you run into the catch 22 of you need experience in another job and you have to kind of go and maybe do a free internship to get that experience before you get a paid job. And it can be very complicated because, as far as an employee's perspective goes, you're just the same as every other candidate. Now, what changed when I added languages to the mix? Before I got into blogging, for several years, I would apply for jobs in engineering firms, but I would be multilingual. So
Mhm.
that would completely make me stand out above the other candidates. So, as an example, I got a job working in Paris for a company, and they hired me not just because my background was relevant to what they were doing, but because I was multilingual. I acted as their pre sales engineer. So that meant that I could explain the technical workings of their software to their clients in multiple countries.
Mhm.
So it meant that entry level, I got in very easily to that job that I applied for. It wasn't a challenge. In terms of pay, I was still entry level, so I didn't necessarily get paid more.
Mhm.
But what happened after that was I combined my engineering background with the languages in a more direct way. And I became a translator of engineering documents. And for that, I was able to earn a lot more. And this was the job I had for several years before I started the blog because there was just no competition.
Right.
I was the only native English speaking engineer who also spoke these other languages, or there were very, very few in similar situations. So that means that the outsourcing companies would always turn to me because they knew I was the one who could translate to this specific specialization better than anybody else. And because of that, I could raise my rates every few months and I knew that they would still give me work. So very quickly, I was earning very, very well. And especially because I was traveling at the time, I could earn in euro and spend in rupees. It makes a very big difference when you're able to take your work on the road.
Right.
In general, for people though, it's like if you have this technical background or if you're from any industry outside of languages, you instantly stand out if you speak other languages. It means that you can interact with their foreign clients, and so many companies need to be able to work internationally, and you can be their point of liaison for that. It
Mhm.
means that maybe that they would send you to conferences in other countries knowing that you could interact with people. So it means you don't have to get into language learning. Like I did have this work as a translator, but like I said, I've also worked just purely as an engineer. And it's been amazing because like I have not had trouble finding work for that stretch of years before starting the blog. And
Mhm.
it's thanks to that combination of having my background in engineering, which made me employable, but not unique, but then adding in the languages that made me unique.
Right, right. And to reach this level of commitment, Benny, if not fluent in 3 months, which do you think is a more efficient way to learn a new language? Is it a course, film, books, or any other format, and why?
See, it's like I was saying before, you shouldn't be thinking of it in terms of how do I learn a language. It has to be how do I live this language?
Mhm.
And this is
Mhm.
how we all learn our mother tongue,
Right.
was having the language be a natural part of our lives. So the mindset of which courses do I buy, it just doesn't really align with how I really feel successful language learning takes place.
Mhm.
So if someone's like, I don't have the resources, that doesn't matter. You could still find human beings that you can interact with to get that practice. So
Mhm.
even if you have no money, like obviously, if you're hiring a teacher, then you have to pay for them and that costs money. But what a lot of people do instead is they have free language exchanges. So if you want to learn Spanish, maybe you will speak English to a native Spanish speaker for 20 minutes. And then for the next 20 minutes, they'll speak Spanish to you. So
Mhm.
that way you're not paying any money, but you're helping them, and it's just a language exchange essentially.
Right.
And that shows that it doesn't need to be about do you have the resources? As long as you have an internet connection, which quite a lot of people do nowadays, you have the resource. Or if you live in a major city, you can find people who are foreigners, kind of exchange students or something. If you're resourceful enough, you'll find ways to be able to interact with them to get that language exchange. So anything like that is what I recommend, is making sure speaking is the centerpiece of what you're doing. And anything other than that, you can also do if you have other goals in the language, like if you want to be able to read the language, just read a lot in the language. And any website you'll find online is available in that foreign language, and you've got free dictionaries. Like there's a million resources for learning a language. It depends mostly on your goals, but it's why hopefully people kind of will read what I write about it and see a general direction that they can go in.
Right. Well, Benny, that kind of ends the first segment. Moving on to an interesting round of conversation. This is going to be the rapid fire round. A few questions coming at you at a rapid fire speed. So are you ready for this?
Sure.
Okay then. Your favorite language?
Brazilian Portuguese.
Teach me a word in 5 different languages.
Word in 5. Okay, how about this? Ananas is the word pineapple in pretty much every language in the world, except for English. So there you go. Instead of 5 languages, I've given you 100 languages.
Fantastic. 3 reasons why people should learn a new language.
It opens up your world. It is extremely satisfying. It'll make you feel fulfilled. And there are so many people in the world. It's such a shame to limit yourself to only speaking to those who speak one language.
Okay. What's one language you regret not learning and why?
I don't actually have that because I'm a very passionate guy. I put my effort and energy where I want it to go. So if there was a language I had wanted to learn, I would have learned it. So I don't have any regrets. I don't feel like I haven't learned a language the way I would have.
Okay. How can one be a part of the polyglots community across the world?
So the Polyglot Community, even though the name suggests that you speak multiple languages, it's actually open to everybody, including people who are just getting into learning their first language. So you don't have to be a polyglot. You just have to care about learning languages. And then you can join in on Facebook groups, and there's loads of people on Instagram who share their language learning. And of course, when the world opens up again, we'll have conferences, and you're more than welcome at these conferences, even if you're not a polyglot, because it also applies to aspiring polyglots.
Great. What's the next language in your radar to learn?
Well, I can't tell you that because I got to keep people in suspense. I need to be able to drop those clues and make sure that they sign up to my email list. So I'm afraid I can't tell you that.
Great. 5 apps, tools that you recommend people to keep brushing their language skills with.
So italki, that's Italki, is one for finding language teachers. Anki, Anki, is a great one for flashcards and remembering vocabulary. Memrise, Memrise, is one for great mnemonics for vocabulary. Word Reference is one of my favorite dictionary apps, and it covers a huge range of languages. And even Google Translate. Like Google Translate, you should not rely on it as your main means of speaking a language. But when I'm an absolute beginner, I do type things into that very quickly to have a general gist of what I want to say. It'll be wrong, I'll have grammar mistakes, but as a beginner, that's okay. So I would use Google Translate too.
Okay. And finally, what's lined up for you this year?
This year, I'm obviously waiting for the world to open up again. And while I wait for that, I am reactivating a lot of my languages because I had a few difficult years where I wasn't practicing them consistently. So I'm taking a couple of months at a time to build each of my languages back up again. And that's kind of my main goal this year, so that maybe next year when I can start getting into travels again, I can start to use them consistently. So I'm using the lack of travels to give me an opportunity to make my future that much better.
Nice. Fantastic stuff, Benny. That brings us to the end of the rapid fire round. And quickly now, time for the third and the last segment of the show. And this is a question from Dhananjay, whose Twitter handle is DJnomics. And he asks, How can you stay motivated while learning a new language through the long and intermediate stage? I tried learning Spanish through a language learning app, but it really didn't help my cause. How can I overcome this?
So it's an interesting question because it talks about the intermediate stage. So firstly, it's great that this person reached that stage, but it's very important to remember that there is no language learning approach that will get you from beginner to advanced mastery. You absolutely need to have a dynamic learning approach. So maybe the language exchange app or the spoken app that this person used, it was useful for them at the beginner stages, but now at the intermediate stages, they need to mix things up. So I would say to this person to really think about what are the biggest problems you need to solve right now in your language, and to kind of throw a nuke at your current learning project and start over. You're not starting the language over, you're just starting over in terms of what resources you're using. So as an example, I tell people, do not use grammar books as a beginner. I really think it's not a useful use of time because we need to be okay with making mistakes, and a grammar book gives you too much to worry about. However, at the intermediate stages, I find that more spoken practice isn't really going to help me. And at that intermediate stage, that is when I actually do pick up grammar books and I will do the exercises, and I'll do a lot more traditional language learning things, traditional language courses, because I think that they actually are beneficial in the intermediate stages, when my biggest problem at that stage is polishing my language up and fixing the mistakes that I have been making, whereas the mistakes are not a problem for a beginner. So that's kind of what I would say, is to completely transform your approach, see what your biggest issues are, and try to focus on solving those issues. And it's okay if the language exchange program you were using before isn't helping you now. That's why you need to have a dynamic learning approach. Your approach will change as your needs change.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of the show, Benny. This was thoroughly interesting and a very new way to look at language learning. I can't wait to catch up with all your new content as well. I hope you enjoyed your time on the show.
I absolutely did. If people want to hear more from me, I've got my own podcast, of course, the Language Hacking Podcast. They can check out my blog, Fluent in 3 Months, and they can find me on social media at Irish Polyglot. And I'll be very happy to point them in the direction to help them with their own language projects.
Great. Thank you so much for making time for the Deliberate Talks podcast, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Cheers. Well, isn't it wonderful to learn something new? So make some time and plan that next language which you have been wanting to learn, and that too in the next 90 days. If you have any feedback about the show, write it to the deliberatetalks@gmail.com, and don't forget to follow the Deliberate Talks on the audio and the social media channels. Join in next Monday for another episode, and until then, don't forget to inspire and be inspired.